There is no preparation for silence, not the silence of deep space, which is simply the absence of atmosphere carrying sound. That silence wardens learned in their first year of service, learned to inhabit, learned to read, the way sailors read water. Not the silence of meditation, which was a chosen stillness, a turning inward that the resonance accompanied like a patient companion waiting outside a door. Not even the silence of grief, which had its own texture, its own weight, the particular quality of a resonance connection severed by death, felt, recorded, mourned. This was different. This was the silence of a word you had been saying your entire life, in every breath, in every heartbeat, in every moment of waking and sleeping and the long median between, a word so fundamental to the structure of your existence that you had never heard it as a word at all, never separated it from the air it traveled in, never understood it as a thing that could be absent, until it was absent. And then the silence wasn't silence. It was the loudest thing you had ever experienced. Warden Prime Issa Thorne had been a warden for 51 years. She had felt the resonance in the deep cold of the outer reaches and in the crowded heat of Concordate Core stations, where 30 million beings lived, stacked in towers that scraped the artificial sky. She had felt it in the presence of the eldest members of the Warden Council, deep, enormous, the resonance in them like old roots below old trees, going down into depths she couldn't measure, and in the presence of new initiates where it was bright and tentative and carried the particular quality of a thing still finding its shape. She had felt it in dying things and in the moment of new life and in the vast, unremarkable median of ordinary existence where most of living quietly occurred without drama or significance. She had never felt it stop. The navigational records would later identify the precise coordinates, a boundary in the outer reaches designated by the Concordate's Survey Division as the Null Shelf, a gravitational anomaly logged 17 years ago by an unmanned probe that had returned corrupted data and been dismissed as a calibration failure. Nobody had followed up. The Fracture Wars had a way of redirecting institutional attention from unmanned probes in the outer reaches toward the considerably more pressing business of not losing. The supply route that had brought ICE's reconnaissance team to these coordinates was a product of desperation rather than planning. A League of Sovereign Systems interdiction campaign had closed 3 primary logistics corridors in the past 6 weeks, and the Concordate Supply Division had tasked a small team to survey alternate routes through the outer reaches that fell outside the League's current patrol patterns. A warden escort was standard for outer reaches surveys, since the Fracture Wars had made them dangerous. Issa had volunteered because she had been inside Concordate command stations for 4 months and had found that her relationship with the Resonance deteriorated in prolonged proximity to political machinery, and the outer reaches, whatever else they were at least honest about what they were. She had brought 3 wardens with her. Warden Cale Doss, who had found the Null Shelf first during a solo route survey 2 weeks prior and had filed a report with the phrase anomalous resonance behavior in its subject line, which was what had elevated it from a logistics document to something the Council classified as requiring senior investigation. Warden Sarah Mine, a cartographer warden whose specialty was uncharted regions and whose capacity for methodical observation under pressure Issa had relied on across a decade of difficult assignments. The End Initiate Cale Dorn, 17 years old, 3 years from full warden status, chosen because Issa believed that whatever they were going to find needed to be understood through young eyes as well as experienced ones, and because Cale was, of all her current initiates, the one who had demonstrated the rarest combination of attributes: the ability to sit with a question without needing to immediately resolve it, and the honesty to say what he actually thought rather than what he believed a senior warden wanted to hear. The survey crew completed their complement, a pilot and 4 technical specialists from the Concordate's Logistics Division, professionals whose primary relationship with the resonance was indirect at best, and who would therefore provide a useful baseline for what the null shelf's effects were and were not. They crossed the boundary at 0640 ship time. The resonance stopped. Isa had been expecting something. Kale's report had described anomalous resonance behavior with the careful language of a warden who had experienced something he didn't have a framework for and had chosen precision over drama in his documentation, which meant the experience had been significant enough to require that choice. She had prepared herself in the 12 hours since reading his report for something difficult, for a diminishment perhaps, the resonance running thin the way it ran thin in spaces that had seen sustained violence or in the presence of certain technologies that disrupted its surface expression without touching its depth. She had not prepared herself for complete cessation. It wasn't that the resonance weakened. No, it wasn't that it became difficult to access, the way it became difficult in exhaustion or grief or the particular kind of sustained stress that the fracture wars had made familiar to every warden currently serving. It was simply gone, between one breath and the next, between one side of an invisible line in space and the other. Everything that the resonance had been for 51 years of her existence was absent, and in its place was a quality she had no name for. She reached for it. That was the body's response, automatic, below the level of decision, the reaching that resonance did without knowing they were doing it, because the reaching had always, without exception, found something. Her hand didn't move. Nothing visible happened, but internally, in the place where the resonance had lived for as long as she had been alive, the reaching found nothing, and the finding of nothing was an experience so foreign to every baseline her nervous system had established that it registered briefly as panic before her discipline caught it and held it at arm's length. She heard Kale make a sound. She knew the sound without looking, had heard versions of it in training halls. In the moment when young resonance first encountered something, the resonance couldn't help them navigate. Not fear of something threatening, fear of something absent. She turned and found his face doing something she rarely saw on the face of a 17-year-old warden initiate who had spent his entire conscious life in a tradition that trained for hardship. Genuine, unmanaged disorientation, the expression of a person whose fundamental orientation toward reality had just been removed without warning. "Warden Prime," he said, and his voice was steady with the effort of making it so. "Reach for it," she said. He reached. She watched him, the internal gathering she knew as well as her own breathing, the movement toward the current that had always been there to be moved toward. His expression traveled from effort to confusion, to something that had no adequate name in the vocabulary of people who had never needed one. "It isn't there," he said. "No." "Where is it?" "That," she said, "is what we're here to find out." Warden Kale Doss had moved to the viewport with the expression of a man revisiting something he had hoped would be less significant on the second encounter and was finding equally significant. It was like this before," he said. "Exactly like this. I ran system diagnostics for 2 hours before I accepted it wasn't an equipment problem." He paused. "Then I accepted it, and it was worse." Warden Sarah Mine, true to herself and to the cartographer's discipline that had shaped a decade of her warden service, had already moved to the sensor station and was converting the experience into data with the focused pragmatism of someone who had learned that discomfort processed faster when it had something useful to do. "The boundary is geometrically clean," she said, reading the instruments. Not gradual, a hard edge, consistent with the gravitational shelf topology. Whatever this is, it has a defined shape. She looked up from the console, and there's a planet, 6th orbital position from the primary star, class breathable, a nominal temperature range, heavy electromagnetic signature. They have technology, significant technology, communications infrastructure, population density consistent with, she ran the calculation, 6 to 9 billion. The shuttle held position at the boundary in the silence that wasn't silence. Outside, the star at the region's center burned with the same light as any other star. Space looked like space. There was nothing in the visible universe to explain why the most fundamental field in the known galaxy had decided that this particular volume of existence was not its concern. Asa Gallia looked at the planet on the sensor display. She thought about the resonance, about what it was, philosophically, in the Warden tradition that had organized itself around it for 4 millennia. Not a power, not a tool. The connective tissue of reality. The proof, as the foundational Warden texts described it, that existence was not indifferent, that the universe threaded something living through all living things, and that the beings who could hear that threading were, by the nature of their hearing, in relationship with something true. She looked at the planet. 8 billion beings, living, thriving, if the electromagnetic signatures were any indication of civilizational health. Building, communicating, existing inside a boundary where the connective tissue of reality, as the Warden tradition defined it, had simply never reached. She thought about what that meant. She didn't finish the thought. "Pilot," she said, "take us in. Slow approach. Open communications on all frequencies. No weapons signatures, no defensive posture." She looked at her team. "Now, and I need everyone clear on something before we go further." She let the weight of the moment be what it was. Didn't soften it, didn't manage it into something more comfortable than it was. Whatever we are without the resonance, that is what we are here. We don't perform certainty we don't have. We don't reach for something that isn't available. We observe this world and these people with the full honesty of what we actually are, which is, right now, people in a ship falling toward a planet. She paused. That's enough. It has to be enough. And we do not allow what we're feeling to become the lens through which we interpret what we find. Kale nodded. The effort behind the nod was visible and genuine, and she respected it. The survey vessel Ardent Lines descended into the null shelf, a crossing deeper into the clean silence of a region the resonance had never touched, and the planet Sorvain grew in the viewport, green and blue and unhurried, wrapped in weather systems, moving with the comfortable regularity of a world that had been turning for a very long time, without any awareness that the rest of the galaxy considered a certain invisible connective field to be the fundamental evidence of existence's meaning. Below, 8 billion people went about their lives with the complete normalcy of beings who had never known what the rest of the galaxy believed they were missing. In the descending ship, 4 wardens sat in the silence of being, for the first time in their lives, simply themselves. No current, no connection, no vast and living network threading their awareness to the universe's full texture. Just people. In a ship, falling toward a world. It was the strangest thing any of them had ever felt. If you want to see more original stories exploring what happens when the things we believe are universal turn out to have edges, hit that subscribe button and drop the concept or scenario you'd most want to see explored in the comments below. The city of Kellen Vast had been built over 800 years, not grown, not accumulated through the organic sprawl of need outpacing design, not layered over the ruins of something older and less considered, built from the founding surveys to the current metropolitan boundary, according to a plan that had been revised 47 times across 16 generations of architects, engineers, and civic administrators who had disagreed productively with each other and arrived, through that disagreement, at something better than any single vision could have produced alone. The founding designers had not expected to see it finished. Their children had not expected to see it finished. It had been completed by people 5 generations removed from the original drawings, and those people had honored the drawings because the drawings were good. And there was no particular virtue in deviation from a good plan simply because time had passed and different hands were now holding the instruments. That quality, patient fidelity to good thinking across long spans of time, was visible in everything from the air. Asa noticed it before the ardent lines completed its descent. Cities built in urgency looked a certain way, dense, uneven, the architecture of need racing ahead of intention. Cities organized around war looked another way. Walls, choke points, the infrastructure of controlled movement and defensible positions. Kalan Vast looked like neither. It had the quality of a thing that had been genuinely considered, not once, not by one mind, but repeatedly and collectively across generations of people who had brought different knowledge to the same questions and built something that bore the marks of all of them. Green corridors threaded through the urban density in patterns Sarah's instruments identified as aligned with both prevailing wind systems and underground water flow. The greenery functional as well as aesthetic, managing air quality and thermal regulation across densely inhabited zones. Transit infrastructure ran below grade, leaving the surface for pedestrians and preserving sightlines that made the city feel open despite its population density. The buildings varied in height and massing according to a logic Isa couldn't immediately decode, but that clearly had one. Not the hierarchical scaling of civilizations that used architecture to communicate power, and not the randomness of unplanned growth. Something else. A logic she would need to be closer to understand. They landed in a designated area. That was the first thing. The communication response to their hailing frequencies had come within 6 minutes of initial broadcast. Not the scrambled intercept of a defensive military installation, not the silence of a pre-technological civilization that couldn't hear them. A clear, organized response on a frequency that suggested Sorvine's people had been monitoring the null shelf boundary for external signals and had prepared a structured protocol for exactly this contact. The landing coordinates had been transmitted with precise navigational data and a message that the translation system, after 14 minutes of processing, rendered as an assurance of safety and a straightforward invitation. Not a conditional welcome, not a demand for identification or explanation. An invitation, the kind extended by a civilization that had looked at the sky long enough to decide that eventual contact was a matter of time rather than possibility, and had decided to meet that eventuality with preparation rather than reaction. The reception party waiting at the landing field was 7 people. No weapons, no security formation. 3 individuals in administrative dress whose bearing communicated diplomatic function without performing authority. 2 carrying recording and sensor equipment, the tools of documentation rather than defense. 2 who stood slightly apart with the quality of advisors present for consultation rather than decision. People whose expertise would be drawn on, but whose role was not, in this moment, to lead. The one of the 3 administrative figures stepped forward as the ardent line's ramp descended. She was perhaps 65 years old, with the face of someone who had spent a long career receiving difficult information and had learned to hold it without being permanently reshaped by it. Her name, the translation system, would establish over the next 30 minutes of careful linguistic work, was Senior Arbiter Valensosa, and her title translated most precisely as something between institutional memory and diplomatic presence. A person whose function was to represent the civilization's considered response to significant events, rather than its immediate reaction. She looked at the wardens with the expression of someone confirming a hypothesis rather than encountering a surprise. "You came through the shelf," she said, so the translation rendered her cadence imperfectly on the first pass and with considerably more precision on the second. "We have been observing the boundary for 260 years. We understood from the physics that the universe beyond it was occupied." "You knew," Kale said. "We inferred," Valensosa said, with a precision that communicated clearly that the distinction mattered to her. "Long-range electromagnetic observation, signatures from beyond the shelf, consistent with technological civilization. Multiple signatures, multiple origins, a galaxy of activity. We could not cross outward ourselves. Our vessels lose navigational coherence at the boundary. The physics changes in a way our current models account for observationally, but cannot yet explain from first principles." A pause. "But we assumed that whoever occupied the galaxy beyond would eventually cross inward. We have been ready for that for some time." "How long is some time?" Asa asked. 260 years, Valensosa said, with the equanimity of a civilization that considered 260 years a reasonable preparation window. The next 7 hours were the most disorienting of Asa Thorne's professional life. The disorientation arrived not through anything threatening or hostile, or even particularly dramatic. It arrived through the steady accumulation of evidence that Kalen Vast was, by every functional measure she could apply, a city that worked, and that it worked in the ways that the Warden tradition had always attributed, explicitly or by implication, to the civilizing influence of the resonance. The infrastructure was maintained with the visible competence of an institution that had developed systems capable of sustaining themselves across generations without catastrophic failure. Not perfectly. There were the ordinary signs of ongoing maintenance, of problems being managed rather than solved, of the incremental negotiation between ideal function and practical reality that characterized all large systems run by fallible beings, but maintained, with the particular quality of maintenance that came from genuine institutional investment, rather than the patching response of a civilization reacting to crises it hadn't anticipated. There was law, not the appearance of law, the actual presence of it, visible in the behavior of citizens toward each other and toward administrative figures, but in the response of populations to public authority that carried the specific quality of considered legitimacy rather than enforced compliance. People disagreed with officials. The disagreements were conducted through established channels. The channels existed because someone had designed them and someone else had maintained them, and the maintenance had continued because the civilization had collectively decided that the channels were worth maintaining. There was medicine. Sarah's passive instruments running continuous environmental analysis identified medical facilities at regular intervals through the urban grid, not concentrated in wealthy zones, distributed according to a logic that suggested deliberate coverage planning, the infrastructure of a civilization that had made a collective decision about who deserved access to care and had built the physical expression of that decision into its city's bones. There was art on every surface that wasn't serving another function, not decorative in the idle sense of filling available space. Purposive, the art of a civilization that had decided culture was a form of infrastructure and allocated resources to it accordingly, the way you allocated resources to water treatment and transit maintenance, visible everywhere, on public buildings and transit corridors, and the walls of the medical facilities and the sides of the underground transit access points, and in the green corridors between residential zones where children moved through public space with the ease of the genuinely safe. Children moving freely, Issa watched them from a market corridor and felt something that she recognized later when she had the distance to name it as the particular discomfort of a person encountering evidence that requires revision of a foundational assumption. Not the sharp discomfort of being wrong about a specific thing, the slow, spreading discomfort of being wrong about the category. The resonance had never been here. None of this had required it. Kale walked beside her through the market district, and she could feel, not through the resonance which remained absent, as completely and cleanly absent as it had been since the moment they'd crossed the shelf. She could feel him processing in the way you felt a person thinking when you were watching their face across a long silence. "Warden Prime," he said quietly. The foundational texts say the resonance connects all living things, that its presence is the evidence, the actual cosmological evidence that existence is not indifferent, that the universe threads something living through all living things, because living things matter to the fabric of reality. He paused. These people matter. Everything about this city is the work of things and people that matter, and the resonance has never been here. It has never registered that they exist. Issa kept walking. "What does that suggest to you?" He was quiet long enough that she understood. The answer he gave was not the first answer he had reached. "That maybe the resonance connects the things it touches," he said carefully. "Not all things. That maybe the tradition is describing something true about our experience of the resonance and treating that as a statement about the resonance's scope. And the scope..." He stopped. Started again. "Maybe we've been saying something that feels universal because it's universal to us, and we never had a reason to examine whether universal to us was the same as actually universal. Is that a permissible thing to think?" he asked after a moment. Not anxiously. Genuinely asking, the honest question of a person checking whether the room was safe for the thought he was already having. "It's a necessary thing to think," Issa said. "Whether it's comfortable is a separate question." Valensosa took them to the Chamber of Record in the early evening, and the Chamber of Record was where the disorientation acquired its sharpest and most specific edge. It was a governmental archive and deliberative space simultaneously, circular, tiered, designed for large-scale collective decision-making with the architecture of a civilization that had concluded, at some point in its institutional history, that the inefficiency of genuine collective process was preferable to the efficiency of centralized authority, and had built its physical infrastructure around that conclusion. The walls carried the record, not digital, not stored in systems that could be edited or deleted, or corrupted by the failure of technology, or the ambition of revisionist administrators. Physical inscription carved into stone and maintained with the particular reverence of a civilization that had decided its history was its most important resource, and had made that decision structural rather than rhetorical. The 4,000 years of it. Issa stood in the center of the Chamber of Record and looked at 4,000 years of decisions made without the resonance, and felt the thing that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately and never quite manage, because the language available to her had been built by people who had always had the resonance and had never developed the vocabulary for what it felt like to understand, for the first time, that the resonance had not built what she was looking at. 4,000 years of philosophy, governance, conflict and resolution, scientific discovery across dozens of fields, artistic traditions that had emerged, developed, influenced each other, been challenged, revised, evolved. The accumulated understanding of a civilization's relationship with itself, with its own nature, its own failures, its own recurring temptations toward the various forms of organized cruelty that intelligent beings seem to carry as a persistent capacity regardless of what else they developed. And in the margins of that history, the evidence of genuine wisdom. Not perfect wisdom. The record included the failures as clearly as the achievements, the periods of institutional collapse, the wars, the ideological movements that had caused harm before being corrected, the slow accumulations of injustice that had required sustained collective effort to dismantle. A civilization that had looked at itself honestly enough to preserve the record of its worst decisions alongside its best ones, because the worst decisions were also information. All of it accomplished without the resonance, not despite its absence, simply in its absence. The way you built anything in the conditions that were actually present rather than the conditions you might have preferred. Kale had gone to the far wall and was reading the inscriptions with the focused attention of a student encountering primary sources for the first time. The particular quality of a young person discovering that history was not the smoothed, interpretively organized version presented in training, but the actual complicated record of actual complicated decisions made by actual complicated people who had not known how they would turn out. Valen Sosa stood beside Isa and watched the wardens move through the chamber with the thoughtful attention of someone observing a reaction she had theorized about for a long time and was now seeing confirmed in its specific details. "You're surprised," she said, "not by us, but by the fact that we don't need what you need." Isa looked at her. "Is it that obvious?" "You've been reaching for something since you arrived," Valen said. "All of you." A repeated internal gesture with no visible object. I wouldn't have noticed it except that our researchers who study the boundary describe a similar gesture. People who go to the edge of the shelf and can feel from a distance what lies beyond it. They developed the same habit, reaching towards something just outside their grasp. She paused. "We have a word for it in our philosophical tradition, the gesture toward the thing you cannot touch. We call it the reaching." "Your researchers can feel the resonance from the boundary?" Isa asked. "Feel its edge," Valen said, "not enter it. They describe it as standing outside a structure where something significant is occurring. You know the significance is real. You cannot access it from where you stand." Her expression was precise and thoughtful. Most of them stopped going to the boundary eventually. The reaching repeated without resolution becomes its own kind of suffering. It was easier to build their understanding from here, where the absence is consistent and the work of living doesn't require the constant reminder of the thing you cannot reach. Asa thought about that for a long time. She was thinking about it when her communication unit activated with the encrypted signal she had been half expecting since Kyle had briefed her on his initial survey report. The signal that meant something had changed in the galaxy beyond the shelf, and the change was moving toward them faster than the timeline she had mentally constructed for having adequate preparation. She stepped to the chamber's edge and opened the channel. The voice belonged to Warden Oryx San, her senior communications officer, aboard the Ardent Lines, and it carried the quality of a professional delivering information he would have preferred to deliver differently but did not have the luxury of time to soften. "Warden Prime, we've received an encrypted transmission through the relay chain. High Director Voss's office has been notified of the preliminary survey report." A pause, the kind that compressed significant meaning into absent space. "We believe the notification was not accidental. The relay intercept shows signatures consistent with deliberate monitoring of Warden Council channels." Another pause. "There are also 3 vessels of unknown registry holding position at the boundary on the far side. They arrived 40 minutes ago. They are not concordant." Isa held the communicator and looked across the chamber of record at 4,000 years of inscribed decisions and felt the familiar weight of being a warden in a concordate that was considerably more complicated than the role the Warden Order occupied within it could always accommodate. The resonance had never been here, and the absence that had unsettled her for 7 hours was about to become the least complicated thing in the room. She looked at Valensosa, who was watching her with the steady regard of a person who had spent a career reading the faces of people receiving difficult information, and who had clearly already understood from the quality of Asa's stillness that something had shifted. "I need to tell you something," Asa said. "The complete version of it, not the version shaped to serve my organization's interests or the political calculations I'm supposed to be performing." She paused. "I've been here 7 hours and I've watched what 4,000 years of honest decision-making looks like, and I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve management." Valensosa looked at her for a long moment. "Then give me the complete version," she said. "We've been preparing for contact for 260 years. We prepared for the possibility that whoever came through the shelf might not be honest with us." She held Isa's gaze. "We hoped they would be. Sit down, Warden Prime. Tell me what's coming." Outside, beyond the shelf, in the galaxy where the resonance threaded through all living things and the dark architecture of High Director Voss's patient ambitions moved through the Concordate's political machinery like a current beneath a current. The machinery was already turning. High Director Severin Voss received the intercepted report at the 11th hour of the Concordate's administrative cycle and read it with the focused stillness of a man who had spent 30 years in positions of significant power and had learned through the accumulated experience of those 30 years that the most important information never arrived loudly. It arrived like this: a field survey report filed by a Warden reconnaissance team following a logistics route, preliminary in nature, careful in language, the careful language of a senior warden trying to describe something her vocabulary had not been built to describe, which was itself the most informative element of the document. Warden Prime Isa Thorne was not a person who struggled for language. She had submitted reports to the High Council, the Concordate Senate, and Voss's own office across 15 years of senior warden service, and those reports had the quality of a mind that knew what it thought and knew how to say it. The struggling in this document was not a writing failure, it was evidence. Voss set the report down and stood at the floor-to-ceiling viewport of his administrative tower on Concordate Prime, watching the city below move through its mourning with the efficient indifference of a civilization that was fighting a war on 3 fronts and had learned to carry the weight of it as background rather than foreground. He had governed this civilization in various capacities across various titles for the better part of 3 decades. He understood its institutional architecture the way an engineer understood a structure they had helped design. Not just the visible load-bearing elements, but the stress points, the tolerances, the places where force applied in the right direction at the right moment would produce effects entirely disproportionate to the force applied. The resonance was one of those stress points. He had known this for 20 years. Not as a personal grievance, Voss had no particular animus toward the Warden Order or toward the resonance as a cosmological reality. He was not a man who organized his ambitions around resentment. He organized them around analysis, and the analysis conducted with the clear-eyed patience of a person willing to see institutional realities without the softening filter of ideology. He had produced the following conclusion: the Warden Order's political authority within the Concordate rested on a foundation that was philosophical rather than democratic. The Wardens had not been elected. They had not been appointed through any mechanism the Concordate's constitutional architecture recognized as conferring legitimate authority. They operated with the autonomous independence of an institution that had existed before the Concordate's current form and had never been fully integrated into its accountability structures because the Concordate had never found a politically viable way to demand that integration from an organization that could legitimately claim to be guided by something larger than political viability. The resonance. The Wardens heard something ordinary beings could not. The Wardens were, by the nature of their hearing, differently positioned relative to truth than those who could not hear it. That was not a claim they made loudly or crudely. The Warden tradition was sophisticated enough to dress the claim in appropriately humble philosophical language. But the claim was there, underneath every interaction between the Order and the Concordate's democratic institutions, and it had always been there, and it had always served the same function. A reason why the Warden's judgment deserved deference that ordinary political actors' judgment did not. Remove that foundation and the Warden Order became something that could be governed, not destroyed. Voss had no interest in destroying the Wardens. They were operationally useful, individually impressive, and genuinely committed to a set of values that the Concordate needed in its service. He wanted them accountable. He wanted them inside the democratic architecture that every other institution in the Concordate operated within, stripped of the philosophical exemption that the resonance had always provided, and replaced with the same oversight mechanisms that applied to everything else. He had spent 20 years looking for the lever, a planet of 8 billion people who had built genuine wisdom across 4,000 years. Without a single resonant among them was not a lever. It was a foundation. He activated his private communication system and gave 4 instructions. The first was to the Concordate's Outer Reaches Fleet Coordinator, whose assignment to the staging area adjacent to the Null Shelf had been arranged 4 months ago under a different operational justification that had since been superseded, a useful positioned asset, now applicable to a revised objective. The second was to a senior Senate administrator, whose function was to ensure that certain deliberative processes moved with more urgency than they would generate on their own. The third was to the Concordate's official diplomatic corps, authorizing the immediate preparation of a formal first contact delegation with the credentials and resources appropriate to a discovery of civilizational significance. The fourth instruction was to no one in the official record. It traveled on a frequency that existed only in Voss's private cipher, carried a message to an individual whose official status within the League of Sovereign Systems made any direct contact an act of considerable political risk, and whose usefulness to Voss's longer-term objectives justified that risk precisely because the League's interest in a force-dead world would, if activated correctly, create exactly the pressure that would make Sorvain's people feel the weight of what the galaxy beyond their shelf could be, and therefore feel, with appropriate intensity, the value of the protection that the Concordate's military capacity represented. He did not want Sorvain taken. He did not want it threatened, damaged, or destabilized. He wanted its people to make a decision about the galaxy beyond their shelf, while surrounded by evidence that the galaxy beyond their shelf was dangerous, contested, and in need of navigating with powerful friends. The Warden Order's transparency with Sorvain's administration, the complete honesty that Thorne's preliminary report suggested she had extended to their hosts, was a complication, a minor one. Honesty about the Warden's philosophical uncertainty about the resonance's universality was useful to Voss's purposes. Honesty about the Concordate's political landscape, the fracture wars, the nature of the competing interests that would now converge on this world, that was less useful. He needed a diplomat on Sorvain before Thorne could finish being honest. He needed one there in 20 hours. He looked at the city below his window and felt the particular satisfaction of a craftsman who had spent 20 years building toward something and had just found the material that made the final construction possible. He had always been willing to wait for the right material. The 3 vessels at the shelf boundary belonged to an organization called the Outer Reach Covenant. Issa learned this from Warden San's second transmission, received while she was still in the chamber of record, listening to the sound of her own carefully maintained composure, and she recognized the name with the specific quality of recognition that preceded dread. Not unfamiliar, not unknown, but known in the worst way, the way you knew the name of a recurring problem that you had managed to avoid for a long time and had understood in the managing that the avoidance was temporary. The Outer Reach Covenant was not a military organization. It was not a government, not a declared faction in the Fracture Wars, not an entity with a formal position in any concordant registry of recognized institutions. It was what emerged when the Fracture Wars created ungoverned spaces in the outer reaches, and certain categories of commercial and operational interest moved into those spaces with the practical freedom of organizations that had stopped needing to justify themselves to any authority capable of enforcing a response. They moved people, they moved materials, they moved information, which was frequently the most valuable of the three. They operated in the margins between the Concordate's reach and the League's, and their relationship to both was the relationship of an instrument that declined to identify its wielder. Voss's instrument, if Issa had to assign a wielder. She could not prove it. She had been unable to prove it for 4 years of watching the Covenant operate in corridors that were consistently useful to Voss's political positioning and consistently damaging to the Warden Order's operational effectiveness in those same corridors. She told Valen Sosa this as well. Valen listened with the same quality of attention she had given everything Issa told her, complete, undefended, the listening of a person who had decided that accurate information was more valuable than comfortable information and had built her professional practice around that decision. So the vessels at our boundary, Valen said when Issa finished, they represent an organization that operates in service of the political figure who is most motivated to use our existence as an argument against your order. Yes, and the Concordate fleet is coming with a diplomat whose function will be to establish a formal relationship on terms that serve Concordate political interests. Yes, and your Warden Council, receiving your report, is deliberating on a response that will be shaped by whatever the Resonance's absence means for the Order's sense of its own necessity. Issa paused. I haven't received their formal response yet. But that is what they're deliberating, Valen said, not a question. Probably, Issa said honestly. Valen looked at the chamber of record around her, at the 4,000 years of inscribed decisions, the complete record of a civilization that had learned to see itself clearly enough to preserve the failures alongside the achievements. Warden Prime, what do the vessels at our boundary want? Access, Issa said, either to your world directly or to the political capital of being the first external organization to establish contact with you. Both are valuable to different people for different reasons. Can they cross the shelf? Not yet. The same navigational coherence problem that prevents your people from crossing outward applies to all vessels we've identified. The shelf affects all navigation equally. She paused. But your people are working on that problem, and if Voss's organization has been monitoring Warden Council communications, they may know that your research into shelf transit has been ongoing. Meaning they may have our research, Valen said. Meaning they may be closer to solving the transit problem than we know, Issa said. Valen was quiet for a moment with the stillness of a person recalculating the timeline of a situation that had just become more urgent. Then she stood with the decisiveness of someone who had made the transition from assessment to action and was done with assessment. I need to convene the Emergency Arbiter Council, she said. 12 people. our senior deliberative body for exactly this category of situation. I want you present, not as a participant, as an observed presence. I want my colleagues to see what a warden is when the resonance doesn't exist." She looked at Issa carefully. "Is that acceptable?" "Yes," Issa said. "Wait, and I want your initiate present as well," Valen said. Issa looked at her. "Kale?" "He's been reading the chamber inscriptions for 2 hours," Valen said. "He reads them the way our young scholars read them, not for information but for understanding. That quality is worth having in the room." The Emergency Arbiter Council convened in a chamber adjacent to the main deliberative hall, and Issa sat at the room's periphery with Kale beside her and watched 12 people conduct an emergency deliberation about the most significant event in their civilization's 4,000-year history, with a quality of structured calm that she found, without having expected to find it, genuinely moving. They argued. The disagreements were real and substantive. A faction that considered any external relationship a fundamental threat to the sovereignty that 4,000 years of self-determination had built and maintained. A faction that recognized with equal conviction that the boundary had been crossed in both directions, and that isolation was now a choice rather than a condition. A pragmatic center trying to navigate between those two poles with the patience of people who had done this before on smaller scales, and understood that the quality of the process mattered as much as the content of the outcome. Nobody appealed to anything beyond their own reasoning and the record of their civilization's experience. Nobody invoked a power they didn't have. Nobody attempted to end the argument through authority, rather than persuasion. They persuaded each other, slowly, carefully, with the respect for counter-argument that came from a tradition that had decided long ago that being persuadable was not weakness, but the fundamental civic virtue, the thing that made collective decision-making worth doing rather than merely performing. Kale leaned close to Issa at one point and spoke in a voice below the threshold of the translation equipment. "They're doing what the Warden Council does," he said. 12 people, significant decision, structured collective deliberation, all of it. He paused. "But the Council has the resonance, has had the resonance for 4,000 years, informing its deliberations, in providing whatever guidance the resonance provides to the process of deciding well." He watched the Arbiter Council with the focused attention of a student encountering something that was reorganizing the categories he had been using to understand the world. And these people produce the same quality of process without it. "Yes," Issa said. "What does that mean for what the resonance is for?" It was the question, the one underneath every smaller question the day had generated, the one that the Warden tradition's foundational texts had never needed to answer, because the situation requiring the answer had never existed. If the resonance was the cosmological evidence that the universe was not indifferent, that wisdom had a foundation deeper than mere intelligence and accumulated experience, then what was the wisdom of a civilization that had built the same quality of institutional care without that evidence? What was the resonance for if you could apparently do without it? Issa didn't answer him, not because she lacked thoughts. She had thoughts, arriving in a continuous and somewhat overwhelming stream that her discipline was managing with less confidence than she would have liked. She didn't answer because the thoughts weren't finished, and she had learned across 51 years of Warden service to know the difference between an incomplete thought and a cowardly silence, and she knew precisely which one this was. The council reached a preliminary decision in 2 hours. Valen presented it to Issa afterward in the corridor, outside the deliberation chamber, with the directness of a person who had spent a career delivering decisions to people who would not entirely welcome them. Sorvain will not extend invitation or recognition to any external party operating under pressure or strategic urgency, she said. Not the Concordat, not the organization at our boundary. Any relationship we build will be built at our pace, on terms we set, with full transparency about what each party wants from us, and full honesty about what we are willing to offer in return. She looked at Issa steadily. We are also accelerating our research into shelf transit mechanics. Within a generation, we intend to be capable of crossing outward ourselves. We want to understand the galaxy we are apparently part of on our own terms. A pause. And we want a warden present on Sorvain throughout whatever process follows, not as a representative of the Concordat, as the individual who came here honestly. Issa looked at her. You want me to stay? I want the warden who told me the complete version to remain present, while the people who will tell me incomplete versions arrive, Valen said. Is that something you can do? Before Issa could answer, Kale appeared at the corridor's end, moving with the controlled urgency of a young warden who had learned to carry significant information without letting its weight show in his body before he delivered it. Warden Prime, he said. 2 things. Warden San is reporting that the Concordat fleet has arrived at the shelf boundary. The diplomat's vessel is already requesting transit coordination. He paused. And the 3 Covenant vessels have moved. They're no longer holding at the boundary. Issa felt the implication before Kale finished the sentence. Where are they? She asked. That's the second thing, Kale said. They've found a crossing point, somewhere along the shelf's southern geometry, a place where the navigational coherence effect is weaker. There inside the shelf. He looked at her with the expression of a 17-year-old who had understood the full implications of what he was saying and was not pretending otherwise. They're 40 minutes from Sorvain's outer atmosphere. Valen Sosa looked at Issa. Issa looked at the corridor around her, the clean, functional architecture of a civilization that had spent 800 years building Kaelin Vast according to a good plan, that had spent 4,000 years making decisions worth inscribing in stone, that had spent 260 years preparing for this moment without any of the tools Issa had spent her entire life believing were necessary for exactly this kind of preparation. She looked at Valen and found what she needed in the older woman's face. Not fear, not the paralysis of a situation that had outrun its preparation, but the focused recalibration of a person whose civilization had faced difficult things before and had developed, through facing them, the institutional capacity to face them without losing the quality of decision-making that defined what the civilization was. I need access to your communication infrastructure, Issa said, and I need you to convene your council again, now. The council is still in session, Valen said, already moving. They anticipated there would be a second item. Issa followed her and Kale fell in beside her, and the corridor carried them toward a room where 12 people were about to make the second most significant decision in their civilization's history in real time, with 40 minutes of runway and no resonance to guide them. Just experience, just judgment, just the accumulated institutional weight of 4,000 years of choosing under pressure to decide well. Issa reached for the resonance without knowing she was doing it. It wasn't there. She let the reaching go and kept moving. The Covenant vessels came in without broadcasting. That was the first information Warden San transmitted from the Ardent lines. No hailing frequencies, no identification signals, no communication of any kind that would create a record of their approach or establish an official presence that could be later disputed or denied. 3 vessels moving through the Null Shelf's southern crossing point, with the practiced silence of an organization that had spent years operating in spaces where the absence of a record was the most valuable thing you could bring to a situation. Isa processed this in the corridor, outside the Emergency Arbiter Council chamber, and understood its specific meaning immediately. Organizations that announced themselves were organizations that had decided their presence could withstand scrutiny. Organizations that moved without broadcasting had made the opposite calculation, that the value of what they were doing was contingent on the absence of witnesses capable of constructing an accurate account afterward. The Covenant wasn't here to negotiate. They were here to establish a fact. Whatever fact they established in the next 40 minutes, a landing, a contact, a transaction, an agreement signed under conditions that Sorvain's administration hadn't been given adequate time or information to properly evaluate, would become the foundation of their claim to a relationship with this world. First contact, however manufactured, carried institutional weight in the Concordate's political architecture. Voss knew that, the Covenant knew that, and the diplomat currently requesting transit coordination at the shelf's northern boundary knew that, which was why the diplomat had been sent to arrive second rather than first, to formalize a relationship whose foundations had been laid by people who wouldn't appear in any official account of the proceedings. Isa told Valen all of this in 43 words while they walked. Valen absorbed it in the manner she absorbed everything, completely, without the defensive processing that made most people slower to receive difficult information than they needed to be. "Can your vessel intercept them?" she asked. "The Ardent Lines is a survey craft," Isa said, "not equipped for interdiction." "Can it communicate with them, officially, on a frequency that creates a record?" Isa looked at her. "Yes." "Then create a record," Valen said. "Oh, whatever they do in the next 40 minutes, make sure it exists in a form that can be examined later. That's the first thing." She pushed open the door to the council chamber. "The second thing is mine." The Emergency Arbiter Council had indeed remained in session. 12 people seated in the deliberation circle, carrying the focused alertness of individuals who had understood from the shape of the first discussion that the day was not finished and had prepared themselves accordingly. Valen moved to the center of the circle and delivered the new information with the efficiency of a person who had learned that emergencies were not served by the performing of urgency, but by its functional expression. Facts, timeline, options in that order, yet without the dramatic framing that made people feel the weight of a situation rather than think clearly about it. The council listened. Then they did the thing that Isa, standing at the chamber's periphery beside Kale, would think about for years afterward. The thing that was so contrary to every political instinct that the galaxy beyond the shelf had normalized across its long history of crisis management, that it took her a full 30 seconds to recognize what she was seeing. They slowed down, not in paralysis, not in the hesitation of people who were afraid to decide, in the deliberate, disciplined slowing of people who had learned, across 4,000 years of institutional practice, that the most dangerous thing you could do in a crisis was allow the crisis to set the pace of your response. The speed was what crises wanted, rapid decisions made in the emotional register of urgency, before the full implications could be assessed, before the question of what you actually valued could be given adequate time to organize itself into a coherent answer. An arbiter named Davin Reth, the eldest member of the council, spoke first. He was perhaps 80 years old, with the particular quality of stillness that Isa associated with people who had been in enough serious situations to know that stillness was a form of capability rather than its absence. "What does the Outer Reach Covenant want from us specifically?" he asked. "Not generally, specifically. What is the value of this world to an organization of their type?" Isa answered from the periphery, because the question was directed at her, and Valen had established that she was present to be heard. "Your location," she said. The null shelf creates a zone where resonant-based tracking and communication, the tools we use to monitor movement through the outer reaches, doesn't function. A presence here, a base of operations here, represents a degree of operational invisibility that no location in the rest of the galaxy can offer. She paused. And the political capital of the contact itself. In the current concordate political environment, being able to demonstrate a relationship with Sorvane, any relationship on any terms, has value to organizations positioning themselves relative to the debate that your existence is going to generate. The debate about your order, Devanreth said. Yes. He nodded slowly. So, they want to use us as an argument. Among other things, another arbiter, younger, a woman named Essie Caln, whose interventions in the first session had demonstrated the particular acuity of a person whose specialty was long-term consequence modeling, spoke without preamble. If we refuse contact with the Covenant vessels, we establish a precedent for Sorvane's right to determine who enters our atmosphere. That precedent is valuable. It costs us a potential relationship with an organization whose intentions are not transparent. If we permit contact under these conditions, said a third arbiter, we permit the establishment of a relationship whose terms we didn't negotiate and whose implications we haven't assessed. The precedent that creates is worse. Refuse, then, said a fourth. On what authority? Asked a fifth. We have no treaty with the Concordate, no formal relationship with any external body. If we refuse on our own authority, we need to be prepared to enforce that refusal. Can we enforce it? Asked Devanreth, looking at Isa. The ardent lines cannot, Isa said, but... She paused, reaching the edge of something she had been circling since Kale's transmission, a thought that had the shape of a decision already made at a level below where decisions were consciously assembled. I can. The council looked at her. Not militarily, she said, but the Outer Reach Covenant operates in the margins between official structures. They derive their operational freedom from the ambiguity of their status. They're not officially anything, which means they're not officially bound by anything. That ambiguity requires that the record remain ambiguous. She looked at Valen. If I meet their vessels on approach, officially, as a Warden Prime on active Concordate-sanctioned survey operation, with a continuous record running, with their approach documented in real time, on a channel accessible to every official body in the Concordate. You remove the ambiguity, Valen said. I make their presence here an official event, Isa said. In official events, the Covenant is just 3 unregistered vessels operating in violation of Outer Reach's navigation protocols. That's a different situation from a quiet first contact that never officially occurred. Kale was looking at her with the expression of a young warden doing tactical assessment. The ardent lines would need to intercept them before they reach atmosphere, he said. At their current approach velocity, you have 19 minutes. I know, Isa said. The ardent lines can't stop them physically. It doesn't need to, Isa said. It needs to be there, visibly, officially, on the record. The Covenant's value proposition requires that the record not exist. The ardent lines existing in their path, broadcasting on all official channels, dissolves their value proposition entirely. She looked at the council. They'll withdraw, not because we can force them to, because the thing they came here for stops being available the moment the record exists. Devanreth looked at her for a long moment, with the evaluating attention of a person who had spent 80 years learning to distinguish between confident assessments and wishful ones. You're certain? He asked. No, Isa said. I'm experienced. Those are different things, and I won't pretend otherwise. She held his gaze. But I've watched the Covenant operate for 4 years, and I know how they calculate, and I know that Voss, the man behind this specific operation, doesn't want Sorvain taken or damaged. He wants it present and accessible for a political argument. Damaged goods don't serve political arguments. Another beat of council silence. "Go," said Davan Reth. Issa ran, not because running was dignified or because it was the composed behavior of a senior warden representing her order in a first contact situation. She ran because she had 19 minutes, and the Ardent Lines was on the far side of the landing field. And the calculation was simple. She was aware of Kale running beside her without having told him to, and she was aware that she had not told him not to, which was its own kind of instruction. They boarded at a dead sprint. Warden San had the ship's systems already active. He had been ready since Kale's first transmission, because San was the kind of officer who prepared for the next development while reporting the current one, and Issa had specifically selected him for that quality. "Intercept course," she said, still breathing hard, dropping into the command position as the ramp sealed behind them. "Already plotted," San said. The Ardent Lines lifted from the landing field of Kalen Vast and punched toward the upper atmosphere with the urgency of a survey craft being asked to perform outside its design parameters, which it managed with the mechanical indifference of a vehicle that didn't know it was doing something unusual and therefore didn't complain about it. Sorvain's upper atmosphere appeared in the viewport, the clean curve of the planet's edge against the dark, beautiful in the way that planetary horizons were always beautiful, the reminder that the thing you were racing to protect was worth protecting. The Covenant vessels appeared on the sensor display at the same moment. 3 ships, larger than the Ardent Lines by a significant margin, approaching at a velocity that suggested they had calculated the window with care and believed they were operating inside it. Their silence on all communication channels continued. No response to the broadcast San had been transmitting since their approach was first detected. No acknowledgement of the Warden vessel's presence. The practiced non-communication of an organization that had decided the record didn't exist until they chose to acknowledge it. Issa opened every broadcast channel the Ardent Lines carried simultaneously. "Unregistered vessels approaching Sorvain," she said, in the formal register of official concordant communication, the language of records rather than conversations. "This is Warden Prime Issa Thorne, Warden Order, Concordate-sanctioned survey operation, under registry code 74 Valen 9. You are approaching a sovereign inhabited world without authorization from its governing administration. This approach is being recorded in real time on Concordate official channels, Outer Reaches Navigation Authority channels, and Warden Council emergency channels simultaneously." She paused. "Identify yourselves and state your purpose, or alter your approach vector. You have 4 minutes to respond." Silence from the Covenant vessels. The Ardent Lines held its position directly in their approach path. Not a physical obstacle. The Covenant ships could go around it without difficulty, and everyone involved understood that. The obstacle was the record, the broadcast, the continuous official documentation of 3 unregistered vessels approaching a sovereign world against the stated objection of a Concordate warden on active duty. A record that would exist in the Concordate's permanent archive, regardless of what happened afterward, regardless of what political arrangements were subsequently made, regardless of how the story was told by people who wanted to tell it differently. Kale was at the sensor station, watching the Covenant vessels approach velocity. "They're slowing," he said. The sensors confirmed it. A gradual reduction in approach speed. The kind of deceleration that didn't announce itself as a decision, but that accumulated over 30 seconds into an unmistakable change of trajectory. The lead vessel adjusted its vector by 4 degrees, then 12, Then the three ships were no longer approaching Sorvain, but moving laterally, maintaining altitude, holding the posture of vessels that had encountered an unexpected variable and were reassessing. Isa kept broadcasting. She described their position, their heading, their hull profiles, their registry absence, their approach timing, their deviation from Outer Reach's navigation protocols, in the flat and continuous language of a record being constructed, rather than a confrontation being conducted. She was not threatening them, she was documenting them. The distinction was everything. After 6 minutes, the lead Covenant vessel broke its silence. The voice that came back was professional, uninflected, the voice of an operator rather than a principal, someone whose function was to communicate a decision made elsewhere. Warden Survey Vessel. We are conducting independent navigational research in this sector under Outer Reach's exploration protocols. We will not be proceeding to planetary approach at this time. Understood, Isa said. Your statement has been recorded. Navigation research in this sector requires Sorvain's administrative authorization under the sovereignty provisions of the Concordate's Inhabited Worlds Charter. I recommend coordinating with the planetary administration directly through official channels before any further approach. A pause. Yes, safe travels. The Covenant vessels held lateral position for 11 minutes. Then they turned and crossed back toward the shelf's southern boundary and were gone. The ardent lines set down again on Kalen Vast's landing field as the last light of Sorvain's sun crossed the rooftops of the 800-year city, and Isa descended the ramp into the warm evening air of a world where the resonance had never existed, and found Valensosa waiting with the composed attention of a person who had monitored the entire operation through the broadcast feed and needed no summary. They'll come back, Isa said. Yes, Valen said, but differently, and we will have had time to prepare for differently. Isa looked at the city around her, the last light on the architecture of 800 years of good decisions, with the green corridors darkening as the sun went down, the ordinary life of 8 billion people moving through its evening routines, with the calm normalcy of beings who had just missed a significant danger and didn't know it, which was, in Isa's experience, the best possible outcome for a significant danger. The Concordate diplomat, she said. They'll be requesting landing authorization. Tomorrow, Valen said. We've responded that the administration requires a day of internal preparation before receiving additional external delegations. The response was courteous and non-negotiable. She looked at Isa with the quality of a person who had been thinking about something for several hours and had arrived at a conclusion she was ready to share. Warden Prime, now I want to ask you something that you're not obligated to answer within the framework of your official function. Ask, Isa said, when you were on the Ardent Lines, when you broadcast on the official channels, you were without the resonance, facing a situation with genuine stakes, operating on judgment and experience and the quality of decision-making that you've built across 51 years of service. Valen held her gaze. How was it different from what you would have done with the resonance present? Isa thought about it honestly. Not the diplomatic version, not the version shaped by the institutional pressures that had been present in every room she'd been in today. The actual honest assessment of what it had been like. I reached for it 3 times, she said, automatically without deciding to, and found it wasn't there. She paused. And then I made the decision anyway, because the decision was available to me without it. It had always been available to me without it. The resonance confirmed things, clarified things, gave me a quality of perception I genuinely value. She looked at the darkening sky. But the decision itself came from 51 years of experience, of choices made and consequences faced, and the slow accumulation of understanding that comes from being present for the outcomes of your own judgment. She paused. The resonance was with me for all of that. I don't know which parts of what I am came from it and which parts came from the other things. I'm not certain that question has a clean answer. Valen nodded slowly. Our philosophers have a concept, she said. They call it the sufficiency of the present. The idea that what exists in any given moment, the tools, the experience, the capacity available, is sufficient for what the moment requires. Not optimal, not complete, but sufficient. She looked at Issa with the even regard of a person delivering something she had thought carefully about. You were sufficient today, without the thing you've built your identity around. Issa looked at her. That's the finding, she said. Isn't it? That's what I have to bring back. Among other things, Valen said. The Warden Council session convened 4 days after the Ardent Lines returned to Concordate space. Issa stood at the center of the council circle, 9 senior wardens and 3 council primes. The full deliberative body that the Order assembled, only for matters it classified as affecting the Order's foundational principles, and delivered the complete account. Not the version shaped for institutional comfort, not the version that protected the Order's philosophical architecture from the implications of what she'd found. The same account she'd given Valen Sosa in the Chamber of Record, the same account she'd given Devon Reth's council before boarding the Ardent Lines, the account of what she had seen and what she had understood, and what the understanding required the Order to sit with, regardless of how comfortable or uncomfortable that sitting turned out to be. She watched their faces. Council Prime Ordus Ven, the eldest, whose connection to the resonance had the quality of deep roots in old earth, whose service to the Order spanned more years than Issa had been alive, sat through the full account with his eyes half closed, and the stillness of a person doing the deepest kind of thinking, the kind that moved below analysis into the slow, fundamental territory where the oldest beliefs lived and were occasionally asked to make room for new information. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Tell me," he said finally, "what the people of Sorvain would say the resonance is if you asked them." Issa considered it. They'd say it's the thing at the edge of the shelf that their researchers can almost feel from the boundary, the music from the other room, real, significant beyond their reach. She paused. They'd say it's what the universe is like on the other side of a wall they've never been able to cross. "And what would you say it is?" Ordus Ven asked. Not to the room. To her specifically. Asa thought about standing on the Ardent Lines bridge in the clean silence of the null shelf, reaching 3 times for something that wasn't there, making the right decision anyway. She thought about the Chamber of Record, about 4,000 years of inscribed decisions, about Kale asking what the resonance was for if you could apparently do without it, about the question she hadn't answered him and was being asked now in a different form by the oldest mind in the Order. "I think it's a gift," she said, "an extraordinary, life-defining, genuine gift, something that has shaped everything the Order is and has produced real wisdom across real centuries of real service." She held Ordus Ven's gaze. "I don't think it's proof. I think we've been using it as proof of our necessity, of our special relationship with truth, of the cosmological justification for operating outside the accountability structures that every other institution in the Concordate lives within." She paused. "And I think that use of it has been wrong. Not because the gift isn't real, because proof and gift are different things, and we've been treating them as the same thing for a long time." The council chamber held its silence. Ordus Ven looked at her with the expression of a person encountering something they had, at some level, always known was coming and had been waiting, perhaps for longer than they had consciously acknowledged, for someone to say clearly, "What do you recommend?" he asked. "Accountability," Issa said. "Real accountability, the kind that every other institution in the Concordat operates within. Not because the resonance isn't real, because the argument that the resonance exempts us from it has been shown by 8 billion people on a world we had no idea existed to rest on a foundation that doesn't hold." She looked around the circle. "We can be what we are, resonant, guided, genuinely shaped by something the rest of the galaxy can't access, and also be accountable. Those two things don't cancel each other out." She paused. "They only seem to if you've been using the first one to avoid the second one." The silence extended. Then Ordas Ven did something Issa had seen him do once in 15 years of council observation. He looked not at the other council members, not at the political architecture of the response he was about to give, but at the resonance itself. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, the inward turning of the oldest resonant she had ever known, consulting the thing that had been his companion for longer than most buildings stood. What came back to him? She couldn't read it. She had never been able to read Ordas Ven's resonant states. They were too deep, too old, too specific to a relationship she could only observe from outside. But something shifted in his face. "Bring Initiate Dorn," he said. Issa looked at him. "Kale is in the junior quarters." "I know," Ordas Ven said. "Bring him. What you've described is his generation's question more than ours. He should be present when the Order begins to answer it." On Sorvane, as the Concordat diplomats' first formal session with Valensosa's administration produced a document that was considerably less favorable to Concordat strategic interests than its author had intended, and considerably more favorable to Sorvane's sovereignty than High Director Voss had planned. 3 things were already in motion that would take years to fully resolve. The Outer Reach Covenant vessels, having returned to Voss's operational network with a report that the Null Shelf's southern crossing point had been identified and documented by Warden survey equipment, have found that the value of the information was substantially reduced by the fact that it was now in official channels accessible to every navigational authority in the Concordat. Voss received this report and recalibrated with the patience of a man who had built 20 years of political architecture and understood that good architecture had multiple load-bearing elements, and the failure of one didn't bring the rest down. He was not finished, but he was not, for the first time in a long time, clearly ahead. The research team that Sorvane's administration had been quietly accelerating on shelf transit mechanics published a preliminary finding 6 weeks after the Warden delegation returned to Concordat space, a finding that suggested the navigational coherence problem was not a fundamental physical barrier, but an engineering problem with a tractable solution. The finding was shared with no external party before being published in Sorvane's own scientific archive, which had been the standard protocol for all significant research outputs since the civilization's 3rd century. Within a generation, as Valensosa had told Issa, Sorvane intended to cross outward on its own terms, and Kale Dorn, 17 years old and 3 years from his full Warden designation, I submitted to the Order's internal archive a document that the receiving archivist classified as a student reflection and filed without particular note. It was 14 pages long. It had been written in the 4 days between the Ardent Line's return and the council session in the junior quarters of the Concordat's Outer Reaches Station 7 by a young man who had spent 5 days on a world without the resonance and had come back changed in a way he was trying, with the honesty that Issa had specifically selected him for, to describe accurately. He titled it, "What the Resonance Cannot Prove." Ordas Ven read it the night before the council session and said nothing to anyone about what he found in it. He didn't need to. The questions it contained were already in the room. They had been in the room since Isa stood at the center of the council circle and said the word accountability in a tone that made it the beginning of something rather than the end, and the resonance, present, generous, threading through the 12 wardens in that circle with the warmth of something that recognized everything it touched, carried the weight of the moment the way it had always carried everything. Not as proof, as company. Outside the Concordate's core systems, beyond the Fracture War's contested corridors, and the outer reaches' ungoverned margins, we're past the gravitational shelf where the physics changed and the resonance stopped, and a world of 8 billion people lived their fully realized lives in the clean quiet of a universe that had decided this particular corner operated by different rules. Sorvain turned in its star's light. The resonance had never touched those 8 billion lives. They had built something worth touching anyway. And in the Warden Order's archive, filed without particular note, a 17-year-old's 14 pages waited for the generation that would know what to do with them. The Order did not change overnight. Institutions built across 4,000 years of accumulated practice did not change overnight. And the Warden tradition had enough genuine wisdom in it to understand that the right response to a significant challenge was not rapid reformation but honest reckoning. The slow, difficult generation-spanning work of sitting with a question that had been avoided and allowing it to reorganize, at its own pace, the architecture of everything built on top of the answer that had been wrong. Ordis Ven lived 11 more years after the council session where Isa Thorne said the word accountability in the tone that made it a beginning. In those 11 years, he convened 14 extraordinary sessions of the council on questions that had never been formally asked, submitted the Order's operational mandate to the Concordate's oversight architecture for the first time in its history, and was present at the ceremony where Cale Dorn, by 20 years old and newly designated, was assigned as the first Warden liaison to Sorvain's administration. Cale crossed the shelf in a vessel that Sorvain's engineering teams had modified to maintain navigational coherence at the boundary. A modification derived from the research that Valen Sosa's council had been accelerating since the day 3 Covenant vessels had approached Sorvain's atmosphere, and a survey craft had placed itself in their path with nothing but a broadcast and a record. He crossed without the resonance and arrived on the other side and did the work, the way you always did the work in the conditions that were actually present, the way 8 billion people had always done it on a world that the resonance had never touched and that had decided generation after generation across 4,000 years of choosing that the absence of proof was not the absence of reason. The reason was there. It had always been there. You just had to be willing to build without the confirmation. May the resonance guide what it reaches, and may what it cannot reach find its own light. More stories await.